spend a lot of time on Arnav's show, so the idea that I can speak for more than a minute or two without somebody butting in makes me very nervous. In fact, the first time I went to Tehelka show and CNN-IBN, after speaking for a minute or two, I started looking around, isn't somebody going to cut me short, say something or the other. So feel free. I'm just going to give you some things about what I think the state of the media is, illustrate some things. I want questions. I want you to interrupt me, ask things that you feel are not clear, your suggestions, whatever I can give. So since the idea is that we are talking about elections and the role of the media and how the media influences elections, let me start with, something basic. I think it's true for cops, for lawyers, and for journalists that if you have to understand a story, you have to understand money, basically. The money that is involved in that story. And if we look at money in the elections in the media, I think you get a very simple picture that tells you where we stand today. The first thing, there are in these elections, I'll give you 2009 figures because I've gone through those figures. We had about 80 crore voters. The Indian parliamentary constituency is about 1 million voters, at least 10 lakhs each constituency. The only comparable elections you see across the world are the US Senate elections. When you look at European elections, the very nature of European democracy is very different. It's 10 or 15,000 people deciding or electing a parliamentarian to the. There's a possibility of personal interaction which is totally missing in Indian sort of democracy when we are talking about parliamentary constituency. Now, to appeal to these voters, you have to spend money. That's a given. There is no way that you can reach out to those voters. And if you take a very conservative estimate, and I'm taking this conservative estimate because it sort of matches the feedback you get from other sort of figures, is let's say that the cost of communicating to the voters, traveling around constituencies, hiring planes, organizing speeches, rallies, etc. Let's put a very, very conservative cost of 100 rupees a voter. Okay. It gives you a minimum cost to the elections of one party, which is national, at about 8,000 crores. Look at the quantities of the amounts we are talking about. If you look at actually a various 2 or 3 national parties, other parties thrown in, we are talking about a national election that from party funding probably touches 20 to 30,000 crores. It's a huge amount of money. We have another figure, the money collected by political parties over the 4 or 5 years. I'll give you the figures that I have with me. This is I think from the Association of Democratic Reform, which says that between 2004 and 2011, 23 political parties, including the Congress and the BJP, collected 4,600 crores. Obviously, that figure would have gone up. I'm talking of 2006 to 2011, but you can say that this figure may have doubled. Against an expenditure of maybe 30,000 crores, the money that is coming to political parties is 10,000 crores. Where do you meet the shortfall? That means there's a shortfall of 20,000 crores in terms of what goes into the elections. A shortfall of 20,000 crores, it's a huge sum. It can only come from basically large corporates, and it can come through money that is siphoned off from corporate deals. Now, why would a corporate give money? A corporate must see profit somewhere along the way. If you are let's say conservatively that the money a corporate is willing to offer a political party on the side is black money, is maybe 1% of the deal, because there are huge other costs, 1, 2, 3, 4%, whatever you want to estimate. We are talking about in 5 years, we are talking of maybe 400,000, 500,000 worth of government corporate contracts signed and money siphoned on the side just to ensure that you can fund elections. I'm not talking of corruption that goes into politicians' pockets. Now, this is the cost of elections to this country. this is something we often forget, that this is the prime driving force for a lot of the corruption we see in this country. This corruption is systemic. If we are not addressing the question of elections, it's not going to go away. So why am I dealing with this when I'm talking about the media? The money is coming from corporates. The money is very, very large. Then you look at the media. Who owns the media? You know, you start running through, let's take names, let's start with the India Today group. The Birlas have put money in, 25%. You look at CNN-IBN, the whole CNBC. Reliance is de facto owner. They can any day encash the money they put in. There's 4,500 crore of Reliance money sitting in CNN. This is declared money. I'm not talking of money rooted through politicians or money on the side. The Times of India is the only media group that earns from media and puts it back into the media. Maybe the Hindustan Times also. But obviously they have close links with the Congress. There's the Outlook is funded by the Rahejas, builders, big corporates. I was with Open Magazine, which was funded by the RPG's Sanjeev Goenka group, a 17,000 crore company. This is the general base of media ownership in this country. Very few of the media houses are purely in it simply because it is media. It is one part of a huge chunk of business for them. The magazine that I was talking about, Open, where I worked earlier, I can tell you that maybe in 2010-11 it made losses of 20 crores. Compared to the whole turnover of 17,000 crores for a corporate group, this is chicken feed. It's not for you and me, but for the owner of this group, 20 crores is nothing major. This just tells you that in terms of the financial interest, the corporate houses involved in media, the gains and losses, the money they are making from media is a very small part of their business. So why are they in this business at all? Let me point out another fact. If you start from 1992, post-liberalization, you've seen an enormous expansion of media in this country. New magazines, new newspapers, new television channels. Let me count out some television channels: NDTV, CNN-IBN, magazines like Outlook, Open was an example, DNA as newspapers, etc. What is common to all of them? None of them is making money. All of them are loss-making enterprises. So why is the media expanding when there is no money in the media? Money in the media is very, very limited. Times Now is the only channel I know that is breaking even and paying for itself. So you combine this corporate interests, huge amount of money into a sector which is actually not making that much money. In fact, is giving you losses. What does that suggest? One obvious implication will be that the investment going into the media is not going into media because media is good business. It is because media is paying in other ways for the money you are putting into the media. What is the other ways in which media can actually help pay off the money you are putting into it? That's where you cash the chips. I mean, that is where you help your friendly politicians, that is where there is a quid pro quo, that is where there is a certain slant in terms of electoral lines, in terms of covering certain politicians, in terms of covering certain political parties. And the simple fact is, none of this is ever in the public domain. I found something interesting with what happened with Tehelka in this whole affair, that here, of course, there's the whole legal case of Tarun, and the case is pretty strong as far as I can make out, and Tarun is going through due legal process. But because Tehelka was in the public eye, for the first time, other media houses started looking at the finances of Tehelka. And the story turns out to be a pretty rotten story. Tehelka is getting money from all sorts of dubious sources. There's strange manipulations going on in the background. And this has been going on not today, but for 10 years or so. Question is it very different from other media houses? Is it very different from other media houses? Is something like this very similar across the media? And my guess is probably, no, it is not very different. Unfortunately, I don't know. Investigating other media is probably the most difficult thing that you can do in this country. Looking at how media operates is one of the most difficult things to examine. My personal feeling is that any media house in this country, the business end of the media should be transparent. That means there should be public disclosure about where your money is coming from, how much money you are earning through the business, what losses you are making, what your advertising revenue is, what your major advertising sources are. All this should be available to the public on request. I mean, more or less an RTI for the business end of media. I'm not saying that this applies to the editorial call of how you decide something or the other. Now, I am shaping the very large contours of how the media operates or the corporate world is situated. You can draw your own premises from what the implications of what I am saying are. Now, in this, and I'm not suggesting that necessarily anybody has to put in great pressure, threaten individual journalists, threaten individual editors. This is happening at a level way beyond individual journalists or editors. Even very senior editors are chicken feed in terms of the kind of game I'm talking about, the kind of money that is involved, and the kind of give and take that is happening. Now, take, for example, a figure like Narendra Modi. I mean, quite obviously, I know that this is an election where there is a certain amount of enormous support for Narendra Modi. And I make no bones about the fact that I'm a pretty strong critic of the man. And I think one of my problems is that, I was talking to Aditya on the way here, that I am sort of aghast by the kind of public discourse we've entered, where my problem is not with people who say they support Narendra Modi. My problem is that we've reached a place in this country where people say there is nothing wrong with Narendra Modi. To criticize Narendra Modi is problematic. To say this man is perfect, that we are basically more or less selecting a deity for ourselves who's not open to criticism, that is where the problem lies. And unfortunately, a huge amount of the country is thinking in those ways. It's a pretty dangerous trend. It is going to create enormous problems for us later. If he does become Prime Minister, I'm not so sure that this is going to happen, but if it does, and chances are that it will. So suppose take a Chief Minister like that, and I'm giving you an instance. I'm not going to cite individual cases of saying this is exactly what he's guilty of, but most major corporate groups have entered Gujarat. One is it's a port state. They have to be based there, and most corporate groups had interest in Gujarat even before Narendra Modi was there. It is not something peculiar to. You look at the fact that Narendra Modi has given huge concession to industry for them to come into Gujarat. You look at these concessions when you have a factory, a large factory, an institution like the Tata coming into Gujarat. From all accounts, and I think each of you should verify this yourself, not my claim, it is not as if it's providing a huge number of jobs locally. There is a huge degree of opposition to the land acquisition there. This is not something that I'm making up. Again, you can check the facts. Where does it add to Gujarat? It really adds numbers to the Gujarat GDP. It is not adding numbers to the average Gujarati's wages, but to the state figures it adds good number to the GDP. It also, because a huge favor has been granted from Narendra Modi to a corporate house, there's a certain sense of obligation, a quid pro quo, a certain kind of pressure that a government can bring to bear on this. Now, is this having an influence on the media at the moment? I certainly think so, it is having an influence. Is that something unique or peculiar to Narendra Modi? No, it is not unique and peculiar to Narendra Modi. The Congress has been playing this game for a very, very long time. Let us not forget that. And in some ways, if Narendra Modi is doing something, or the BJP is exerting certain pulls and pressures on the media, it is because the Congress has played this game for a long time and people have learned from this game. You know? And this is the place where we are at today. That this is the kind of influence that can indirectly happen. Let me cite an instance. I mean, why something like this happened, I'm leaving the implications. You know, I have to say a lot of things, let you tease out what those things imply, because yes, I will have no proof or evidence to back this up. Not the kind of proof or evidence that will lead me to write this story out and say, look, this is what is happening. My colleague, editor of the Hindu, Siddharth Vardarajan, after a family dispute, left the Hindu. Now, the India Today was interested in hiring him as an editor. I think the talks got to a very advanced stage. In fact, I think, if I understand correctly, is that there was a commitment that he would be given a letter for being hired. And a day or two before the letter was to be given, the 4 assembly election results came out. These were the results which were the first clear indication. I think for most of us it was quite clear, but these were the first real indications that the political winds are now very, very strongly in Modi's favor. The entire process got scrapped. I mean, India Today still has not appointed an editor so far. So it is incidents like this that lead you to sort of ask questions. I mean, I'll cite my own individual case. Again, I was working with a magazine, a pretty large magazine. I mean, I think we were pretty critical of both Narendra Modi, Rahul Gandhi, for example, even the Anna movement. I think we were not taking sides in terms of not being critical. I think part of the fundamental job of a journalist is to be skeptical, critical, to stand outside and ask questions of whatever is unfolding before us, what is happening before us, and we were doing that job. And I had very little inclination that there was any problem with taking that stance. Till one day I was informed, you know, that I should move on. The magazine would like me to move on because, so I asked, really why? You know, I mean, you don't have a problem with my work. You tried to give me a wage hike to keep me here. You've been saying that you like what I've been doing, etc. They say, you know, there's a mismatch between our political visions. Now, 5 years there had been no mismatch. When you hear that there's a mismatch of political visions 4 months before the election, of course, you start thinking that there seems to be something problematic here. Then I was told that there was some pressure from high up, political leaders who were putting pressure. And I still don't know, because as far as I was concerned, it could be political pressure from any side of it. Is it because I've written equally scathingly about everybody across the political spectrum? The long story, I said I'm not going to quit. I don't think I've done anything wrong. They waited 2 months, they offered some money, they finally sacked me and challenged them in court. All that is proceeding. I mean, you must understand that in this circulation of black money between corporates and politicians and the electoral process, you guys are one of the future beneficiaries. And some of this money does recycle back into your pockets. So that case is going on. But ever since the dispensation which existed in open for 5 years has changed, the political stance of the magazine has changed. It's gone to a 180-degree shift. Now, you know, this is one of the strange things in the Indian media. In the West, one of the things is when you're reading The Guardian, you know, you can change 5 editors, you can change a top level of editorial leadership, but you know what to expect of The Guardian. The Guardian is not suddenly going to be cheering Margaret Thatcher. It doesn't happen. You know where the Telegraph stands. You know what the New York Times political view is. So a magazine has had a certain political stance for 5 years. It goes to a 180-degree shift. No questions are asked. Has the owner changed his political views 3 months before the election? Why? Has he gone through a change of heart, a sudden intellectual sort of realization that, you know, I mean, it was wrong all along, that his family for 2 generations has been serving the Gandhis loyally, but suddenly he feels that, you know, Modi is the man that he should have. I mean, these are good questions. But aren't these the questions we should be asking? One of the problems with the Indian media is that there is no ideological commitment. An editor can come and go, an owner can come and change the political stance of an entire magazine, a channel, or a newspaper. Again, without any questions being asked. There are very few organizations in this country. The Hindu, you know, will stand one way. And probably the pioneer, As long as it's owned by Chandan Mitra, will stand one. But even the pioneer, the day the ownership changes and somebody else will take it up, it will become some other reason. So we don't have ideological affiliations, we don't have positions. We have personal affiliations, personal quid pro quos, personal benefits from certain kind of involvement. Now, in this kind of environment, owners, as I clearly said, have no stake in journalistic independence. So, where does the stake arise? How do journalists negotiate this climate? How does a reader negotiate this climate? We were talking about this again on the way here that every Sunday morning you wake up and see that there's discussions going on. Narendra Modi is going to speak in this rally. He's going to say this. Is he going to say that? What is the impact of this? What is the impact of that? And in the evening, there's a post-mortem of he said this. What impact has that had? And week after week, it is building up. But I can't conclusively assert that this is a euphoria that has been paid for or built up. I don't think so. The media is also a business of eyeballs. It's a business of attracting attention. If the majority of the country feels one way, there's a feedback process that builds in. If you want the numbers, if you want the TRPs, and if a lot of people are actually interested in Modi is what you give them. So I'm not so clear that it is always entirely a question that all this is paid for. It is not the case. It is also the media providing what a lot of the viewers want. So there's a give and take of that process. But yes, what has happened is, what you have to keep watching out is for sudden changes in ideological affiliations within organizations, individuals who have these sudden changes of heart, journalists who suddenly started speaking different languages, all at a time when the electoral wind changes. And I think this filter of skepticism is very, very necessary in an audience, a viewership, a readership. And I think at the moment this is missing because we still don't realize the potential for influence and the kind of corruption that exists within an organization. And this is simply because there are very few safeguards and very few people willing to act on those safeguards within the media. Once
so you spoke about 3 or 4 things.
Sure.
Corruption within the media, the corporate media nexus, the nexus between say politicians and the media, changing opinions within the media. All of these things lead us to a point where perhaps we need a regulator, maybe internal, maybe external, for the media. Whenever there is talk about regulation for the media in itself is very critical of it. The media has never taken very wide criticism of the media as a whole, or to the whole idea of a regulator. What my question perhaps is that why is it that the media is so protective of its own term, even though there is so much which is going on which is wrong, starting from say the Z and Jindal story, right down to Meera Radia, where Open and Outlook were the only 2 magazines which published the Meera Radia tape transcripts, and everyone else backed it up. So when there is so much which is wrong, when there is so much which is which visibly can be changed through regulation, ownership, disclosures, etc., why is there such an opposition?
And I'll come back to the Radia tips, and you mentioned that because I think it sort of illustrates this whole thing. But take up the question of a regulator. One is, there is a difference between having a regulator and having a regulation. And I've suggested some steps which nobody in the media should object to, which don't need a regulator, but which actually gives information into the hands of the viewer and the reader, which is actually more important than a regulator. For example, opening up the business end of the media. At the time of elections, who is paying for advertisement? How much money is each paper getting from a particular party? How much money is each business house putting? This is information that should be readily available. I don't think the media should have a problem with this. There is no sense of censorship or regulation. There is no individual telling you this to do this or not to do that. This is only opening up information in the same way you ask every other institution in the country to have more disclosure of information. I think the first step forward have to be steps like this. That is that you don't necessarily need one person regulating the media, but that there is a certain set of norms which make for a freer media. Disclosures, norms on the kind of ownership that can exist. As soon as you have somebody who has an interest in power plants, also wants to bring out a magazine, what is going to happen is if he wants to open a new power plant, say in the state of Gujarat, he will be politely told, I'm reading your magazine here, it's really slightly problematic. जरा देख लेना, अच्छा आ जाइए अगले हफ्ते आपको एक वो clearance मिल जाएगी, permit मिल जाएगा. It's very clear what happens, So if you are in the business of media, who should be in the business of media? Now these are questions that are not for the media to address. This is a question that is as important to you as it is to me. I mean, what is the kind of media we want in a society? What role should the media have? Who should own media? What kind of freedom should exist for the media? Is an open debate. It's a legislative debate that should happen. It is legislation that should be passed. I don't think anybody in the media can oppose the fact that this kind of debate should happen.
I'm just wondering, the problem with that seems to be that while this model would work perfectly well under, say, normal, ordinary circumstances where you would view the institution as a solid block. But in times like these, where the organization tends to be more individual run than the institution run, right? So the regulation wouldn't extend so far as to saying, so where is the editor getting the money from? And that's what's crucial.
Well, look, I think one of the things I'd say is that much of this influence that we are talking about is not happening at this group level, where the editor has been given a flat or a car or has been given money, etc. The editor is largely towing the line because he wants to keep his job. It is the owner who has been influenced. It is where the money that runs the organization that has been influenced. A major part of our problem is there. In fact, because this is where the problem lies, you find that when you have bodies which supposedly self-regulate, whether you call them the Editors Guild or the Broadcasters Association, etc., they always intervene only in circumstances where commercial interests are at threat. They will never take up cases of individual journalists facing up to owners or individual journalists under threat or journalists defending their right to actually write about what they want. They are actually defending an owner's interest, these bodies. And simply because in this kind of media, there's a pre-selection going on. Most of the editors that are put in those positions of power are already people we know who will, when the time comes to the line. You are very rarely ever going to encounter an editor who is a figure who will just say, no, I'm not going to do this. This is not how media works. This is not how journalism is about. There is something more to journalism than just running a business. So, at the level of the editor, I don't think any safeguard really makes much of a difference. Because you can always find other editors who will toe the line. Sure. Which order do you want to go ahead? You've been raising your hand.
I was wondering, because we were just talking about
regulation, right? And whether if there is a legislative conversation, let's say, about how to regulate the media, would the media cover it or encourage this conversation?
No, I mean, the point is, this coverage of this kind of event will be filtered through exactly the lenses that I'm telling you about. If it is against the owner's interest, it will be covered in that manner. You can look at recent coverage of the wage board for journalists, which has happened. And all of it is about how it will break the back of newspapers. I have not seen a single article about how does a journalist barely eking out a living in a place like a small town in Chhattisgarh or in Jharkhand or in Maharashtra, what the wage board means to that person, the kind of salary he lives under and what the new salary will be. You will never get articles like that, because the lens of control is always the owners and the medias. You have to be prepared for that. There is in fact a standing committee report which is actually available on the net. Finally Parliament got around to it. That has not been discussed in Parliament, but it is up on the net, which has asked questions, and these are questions that are of value as lawyers. The old system of the wage board and the Working Journalist Act. There's a Working Journalist Act which actually The recourse under the Working Journalist Act is under the labour codes. So the labour laws apply to the Working Journalist Act. This has been bypassed by something called the contract system in journalism, which is a 2-year, 3-year contract. But actually, if you go back to the Working Journalist Act, it clearly says that whatever is there is over and above any contract that exists. Most journalists don't even know of this. They don't even exercise this legal recourse. The few who are willing to, who know about this, will not exercise this recourse because you'll be seen as a troublemaker. You may be able to fight this employer, but if no other employer is giving you a job, I mean, that's really not here or there. So everybody goes by this contract system, which is a hire and fire system. I mean, this is not the system you want for your journalists. I mean, if the journalist feels that this is what he's done is right or she has done is right and this is what she's written is defensible, and yet can be fired without no reason being given. I mean, one of the important things about the Working Journalist Act is you cannot terminate a journalist without specifying or spelling out a reason for termination. Under the contract system, hire and fire are going on, and editors and journalists are accepting this. I mean, it should be an intolerable situation that you cannot tell a person to leave a job. In places like what we call Western free market democracies, in the UK you cannot dismiss anybody without specifying the reasons why you are terminating services. Here you can do that to a senior journalist, and journalists are not asking questions. So yeah, the standing committee report is there. It's talked about the problem with the contract system. It's talked about guarantees within the system. It's talked about the problems with who can own media. All these things are there. I think if you just Google and look, take out that report, it's there. It hasn't come up for discussion before Parliament, but for once a lot of thought has gone into it. There's been little or no reportage of it in the media.
Yeah. Don't ask any counter questions because of the paucity of time.
No. But sir, the issue part in this question you asked, you highlighted the problem of money and how media is financed by activities, right? So, and you told us about how Open Magazine was earning 20 crore rupee loss in some financial year. So in this kind of a scenario, the owner will obviously have a number. So will the media, and it's a question that asked quite well, would people be ready to accept, would I pay ₹100 for a newspaper that does not have advertisements, right, and which is totally unbiased, whatever that is, right? I don't know the answer at a very personal level, right? And in this kind of a scenario where any kind of good journalism requires institutional backing and perhaps a lot of money also, in this kind of situation, what role does social media have? So separate question.
One, I mean, that question is a question only you can answer. I always ask this of audiences. The question is, yeah, actually the media costs far more than what you as consumers pay for it. And it is being subsidized by other interests. Once it's being subsidized by other interests, actually step in and say, look, those people who are subsidizing it are exercising control is actually partly an absurd point of view, because the subscription system is not working, you need advertising. Two things. One is to just look at what the internet is doing and then come to social media. Across the world, the media in terms of profitability is in crisis. The shift to the web is getting very, very difficult to adjust. And why is that? On the web we are used to things being free. Yeah.
So profitability, when we get to the question of profitability, you can never go up. I mean, if the question is about profit, you can never raise points which
No. When I say profitability, let me be clear. We need at least that much profitability. At a basic level, let's agree that the media should pay the journalists' wages. It should pay for their travel. It should pay for news gathering. It should break even after all those costs have happened.
That's the system.
So no, the fact is, even somebody like the Guardian is not breaking even on those costs, because people have shifted to consuming media online and are not willing to pay. They are not even willing to pay the minimum charges they are willing to pay in print for consuming media. This is creating an enormous crisis. Maybe only organizations like The Economist or the Wall Street Journal and now the New York Times has managed to set up paywalls which people are actually paying for. But otherwise, the media is in a crisis. Here we still have readership growing, so that crisis will hit us maybe 5 or 7 years down the line, but it's already happening. But it's also creating certain places of advantage. That since on the web right now, the idea is to attract eyeballs, because advertising on the web doesn't seem to work as well as advertising on print. for example, my getting into problem with my owners, I managed to get by quite happily because a lot of people with the same kind of corporate ownership structures were quite willing to pay me to write for the web simply because there were people who were willing to read. So that there was a direct connect between my readership and my writing, and they want to attract that readership, which is what you would want of the subscription model. But that's again not a long-term sustainable model, what I'm suggesting. Social media is not going to pay for the cost of a journalist who's going to travel. You know, in the end, however much emphasis we may put on opinion, on terms of views, etc., the basic facet of reported news, in fact this is the mistake the New York Times initially made and they realized, is when they first put up their paywalls in terms of who will pay what for news, their paywall was on opinion and the reportage was free. And it was a big mistake because, you know, opinion is free on the web. You know, there are good opinion writers who are writing, you don't necessarily need to turn to the opponent. But the reportage the New York Times is giving to across the world, that cannot be replicated by social media, it cannot be replicated by the web. That is what people will need to pay for because you are not going to get it anywhere else. The question is, does it have that value? We'll find out. But I think it does have that value. To suddenly get reportage declining in a country like ours, where huge parts of the country are still not well covered, and everything descending to a studio discussion in Delhi, that would be a very, very dangerous trend. But this will be only possible if you or anybody else is willing to pay for it. And if you aren't, well, I mean, there's nothing you and I can do about it.
We're getting the journalism we deserve.
But to a certain extent, I mean, there have to be other models, there have to be other ways. And I'm seeing even within the advertising kind of market, if there are safeguards on ownership, the right of journalists are respected, you know, with all these problems, we did fairly well for 5 years at Open. You know, we did publish the Tamil tapes. You know, I know how problematic it was. You know, nobody else was willing to touch on it. I was quite aghast for 2 months. I was sitting there listening to them all alone in this country, and I mean, I know that these things exist, but to hear them firsthand is shocking. And it is telling you something not just about politics and business, about your own profession, the way we conduct ourselves and how we become a biomedia in this conversation. In the same way that I'm talking in abstract terms, those tapes are a pretty concrete realization of how journalists are a biomedia between this corporate world and the political world. And we are a source of how information, and if information is flowing this way, obviously some of the money is flowing in other ways through the same channel, through the same conduits. We did publish them. So I mean, in the sense that if certain safeguards are provided, if certain sureties exist for journalists, people will still take those risks. No, they won't. But what I'm saying is that Open was working on a sort of advertising model. I'm saying that we were willing to take the risks and we managed to get by with it. I'm saying so. You may not get a perfect media, but the question is, how imperfect do you want your media to be? That is also an important question. Go ahead. The back?
Yeah. Okay. Firstly, in recent times, one particular phenomenon, I don't know if it's particularly recent, but I've noticed it recently, is political ownership of media channels, newspapers, print, electronic, etc. Right? In an atmosphere where having objective reporting is fairly impossible, is the next best alternative having a multiplicity of whatever politically owned media covering the spectrum that exists? That's one. And secondly, you alluded to the declining role of the journalist in the media, right? And the fact, and would giving journalists sort of more space, right, whether by unionizing them or otherwise, and I don't know if those solutions are feasible, would that be a solution to making the media freer than it is today?
See, 2-3 questions there. One is, I don't know if objective journalism is a criteria we should aspire to, because that's a term I don't know whether it makes any sense. What I would like is that we can aspire to independent journalism. You know, at least when you're consuming news, you should be sure I am critical of Modi and I will write critically of Modi, but at least You should have the awareness that I'm doing so because that is what I really believe. I'm not doing so because my owner has been paid to go after Modi, or I've been paid to go after Modi, or my magazine has been paid. So I'm saying at least let us distinguish between those two criteria, and let us ask for at least an independent media, not necessarily an objective media. Now, once you ask for an independent media, the kind of situation you are saying may be a problematic one, which is why I am stressing the fact on disclosures, protections of journalists, etc. To come to the scenario you are posing of sort of competition of racketeers that you made, look at one of the things that has happened, and we've forgotten that, this whole expansion of television. I've spent 8 to 10 years of my reporting life outside Delhi, in small in districts in Punjab, then in Madhya Pradesh, and I feel this Delhi-centric view of this country is highly problematic. And I was there in these places when the TV channel expansion was happening. And suddenly you found stringers with cameras. In small towns, you would suddenly have 5 stringers. And they'd shoot their own footage and send it to the channels, and the channel would choose to use it. And most of these stringers, I don't blame them. The kind of situation they were in, they were close to some politician, some businessman in town. But the fact was that every politician or businessman had his own stringer. And it more or less ensured that most news did not get suppressed at the local level because the politicians were fighting with each other, etc. But there would be situations in which there would be one dominant political or mafia personality in town, and suddenly all news would die. So it depends on the kind of situation. Will you always have 5 racketeers if we provide competition? You might not. The second is, if there is no disclosure, how do you know the political affiliations of a particular newspaper? If you don't know the business end, you don't know the associations, you don't know where the money is coming from, how do you guess? I mean, if I ask you to guess, you may pretty well come close to understanding the political affiliations of the major newspapers or magazines, but I think the story is far deeper than what you can guess. And I mean, I'm not even beginning to tell that story because unfortunately I don't have the evidence to back that up, but I pretty well know that, I at least have the information that when I read a newspaper, I almost see it has a certain advantage. If I want to know what is happening in the Congress, within the party, but close to a particular leader, this journalist might not be a bad guy to read. He's a bloody skunk, but at least he's close to that leader and he's going to tell me what information is available. So it helps me, but that's not information an ordinary reader has. How is he going to filter the process?
So my question is more in terms of what happens within a media house or an establishment. What's the level of transparency that goes into decision making, and in terms of what comes to the editing table? Is there a certain ideological commitment that's sort of pushed for in terms of selecting stories, and which should be given greater coverage?
Largely on a day-to-day basis, you'll be surprised that most of the big newspapers, magazines have a pretty transparent procedure. News comes in 95 or 97, 90, I don't know what quantity you want to put this, is made through reasonable editorial decision making. When you put something on the front page, you need to justify what it's on the front page, and editorial makes the call of, this will be important, this will get readership. Why is this an anchor? Is this a certain quirky story? Why is this the lead story? Much of it is made on journalistic considerations. And it is because so much of our news is actually made on journalistic considerations that we are in great danger, because it's the 1 or 2%, it is the off chance when actually influence has to be peddled, and when those big changes get made, that it gets more dangerous. If you have propaganda thrown at you every day, that's not a problem. Most people know that it's propaganda. They are not going to take it seriously. It is when that there is a degree of seriousness already within the product that when it goes wrong on particular days on particular issues, that people really are suffering.
So I was wondering, why is there so much caginess within the media of doing stories on other media organizations? In terms of so little coverage of what is happening in the Hindu when Mr. Varatharajan was out dropped, and for now we saw Caravan carrying a story on CNN-IBN, but that's so rare. I mean, TV channels don't carry stories about other TV channels. Is that again do you see some sort of, it's convenient for them not to do that in that sense?
Well, two, three things. One is, of course, the thing is, media stories are consumed with great interest by readers. So the idea that they don't attract readership is nonsense. That can't possibly be the reason. But every profession safeguards its own. It's true as true of lawyers that is of journalists. And the quickest way of becoming unpopular is to sort of point out what is a problem within your own profession. But I think once the profession gets to a certain size, that changes. And more and more journalists themselves want this to happen. Because what happens is that it empowers a huge amount of journalists who actually want to just go ahead and do their job without all these pressures. But the decisions, as I said, are from top down. No owner wants question of finances investigated in another media when their own finances are not in order. How do you go about reporting on other media when your own house is problematic? And since almost every media house is facing that problem, how are you going to write about another media house in that same situation? And I think that is the biggest threat.
One would almost expect this to get worse because Al-Qaeda once said after the emergency that when the media was asked to bend, it crawled. That was during the emergency. And by what we're seeing now that the rise of Modi is almost inevitable, is that similar pressures would be put on the media once he comes in. So I was just hoping to know as to what kind of safeguard might be put into place, or an internal or external, to safeguard the media from such pressures. Because entrenched corporate pressures are already there, right? Having a prime minister or having a government which supports such pressures would only downgrade the media to another extent. So how do you get back?
These safeguards are not going to get in place immediately or certainly with this new government. And part of it is individual decisions will have to be made. Yes. I don't think there is anything peculiar to journalism that when we are asked to bend, we crawl. I think we may call it a national characteristic. It is not something that is very, very peculiar to us as journalists. What will happen after these elections will be very interesting, because I think this will be the real test. I don't see that the first signs or the first problems with the Modi government will be necessarily that we will have communal polarization. I think the first problem will be intellectual dissent. He has already shown a great intolerance for criticism. So what we are going to see is exactly this. Journalists, academicians, people have lost their jobs in Gujarat. Somebody like Shiv Vishwanathan had to leave. He is here. So these are the kind of issues that he faces first. And I think these are the questions that will answer themselves. But look, I think in this country, there is only so much that can be done. There are still organizations here and there who will provide a certain kind of job security. There is the internet, there is social media, the possibility of absolute silencing is no longer there. So, but it will get close. Certainly it will get much better.
Institutional support for
will become more and more limited.
Sir, I might be wrong, but with respect to your monologue, there was this underlying thread of the victimization of the journalist. So I have a question regarding the sensationalization of news in the media, and whether it is a choice that journalist is making individually, or whether his intention is to feed to the readers what they want to hear.
Look, it's both. I'm not saying every individual journalist has this great consciousness and wants to sort of perform a particular role, etc. There's a huge diversity within the media. That there is an element of, yes, attracting numbers and feeding a certain kind of demand. But certainly it is there. If you have a certain characteristic to prime time shows, if Times Now is a model that eventually somebody like Karan Thapar is also adopting, that is the show to which audiences are going. It is not entirely that has been forced on the audience by journalists. There is an element of an audience actually reacting and liking. One of the important things that has happened with primetime television that has not been commented on enough is long format news reporting has disappeared. You look at the BBC, you look at Al Jazeera, and half an hour long programs from trouble spots, something on science, something what is happening within this country. And if you look back at the NDTV of the early days, this was what NDTV was doing. That has totally disappeared. Now, why has it disappeared? It is simply because of the economics. You know, to put 6 panelists up, have them shout at each other. You know, I mean, there are a lot of things about Arnab which are underestimated, and I mean, that's a separate argument. But what I'm saying is that there's a certain format that is here which is getting replicated on media. And this costs maybe 1/10 or 1/100th of what it costs to send a team of reporters into a place, look at a story in depth or edit it, doesn't it? And at the end of it, I mean, truth is unfortunately, if half of this room would watch the prime time Arnab show, only maybe 1/10 of this audience will watch the news report, and that is what is driving the news report of the prime time slot on news. I mean, so it is both a question of demand and supply, and it is very difficult to identify whether this problem starts with the journalist or whether it starts with the audience. I think there's a give and take of both happening in this process.
So what do you have to say when Mr. Arvind Kejriwal gives the statement कि सभी मीडिया वालों को, भ्रष्ट मीडिया वालों को जेल भिजवाएं?
If he's saying that सभी भ्रष्ट मीडिया वालों को जेल भिजवाएंगे, I mean, I would have no problem with that. Here, I think absolutely jail corrupt journalists. But I have a problem with what Arvind Kejriwal actually implies and says in so many words. As far as he's concerned, the only patrakars who are brushed are the ones who are critical of it. जो उसके समर्थन में बोलते हैं वो भ्रष्ट नहीं है. That is where the problem lies. The problem is not that you jail भ्रष्ट patrakars. The subtext of what he's saying, and he's saying it in so many words, is कि मैं वो ही भ्रष्ट पत्रकारों को जेल में डालूंगा जो मेरे खिलाफ हो.
Okay, I as a commoner have a great picture in my mind which the media has made before 1992, as you said. So media is considered as a very credible source of information. And post 1992, media changes, concentration, disappeared from the issue. There are farmer suicide, nothing being shown. But I as a commoner have still the same picture. Media will show me the very credible news. So what I should do, which news channels I should see? This is a great question in every commoner's mind. When we have this Rajat Sharma of India TV, first to Russia, change the whole scenario of the news. This is something else, this is contrary news. So, this is kind of...
Want to, if I may, sort of argue against the basis of this question. I actually don't believe that the media has become worse after that. I think this is part of the change in this country and a certain nostalgia we have. As I said, जैसे मैं वो बात कर रहा था कि in a small town there are 5 young boys with cameras running around, most of them on the payroll of somebody or the other. But the fact is, from that town, news is coming out in a way that it never came out 20 or 30 years ago. Also, I mean, you compare, look at post-84, I'm talking of the 84 killings, you look at post-84 to 94 and you compare that with 2002 to 2012, and you look at the role of the media in those two periods. The pre-1992 media failed us entirely in looking at the government suppression of the killings. I'm not talking of what happened in 84. The story of from 84 to 1992, how evidence was suppressed, how witnesses were coerced, how inquiry commissions were raped. As well as I think one of the most fascinating things I find in this country is that we are a country which has exceeded everybody else. We have used the very institutions of justice to subvert what they are supposed to deliver. Other countries ask for truth and reconciliation commissions. We set up truth and reconciliation commissions to ensure that there will be no truth, no reconciliation. But that story in 1984 to 1992, if you go through the media, I mean, I've been trying to look at the terms under which the Ranganath Mishra Commission was set up, the kind of evidence it took, the kind of affidavits submitted before it, the kind of coercion, no report out. Compare that with 2002. The difference is people feel that this was meant to target Modi. No, the nature of media has changed. The media has actually done a much better job post 2002. That is what has really changed. In this, a lot has gone wrong, but I'm saying let us also not forget that the media has also done much better today than it was doing 30 years ago, for all its problems. अब इसमें से which media to watch or not watch, I don't know. That's a choice you'll have to make.
I wanted to talk about like the news experience on the internet, and like, I mean, what the reader, like feeding to the what the reader wants to read is a big part of how the internet news works. Like Google or Facebook aggregates news, and they're following this platform of like, you know, we'll give you the most relevant news that that will tailor, that is, it is actually, they call it tailor-made streaming of the internet,
Sure.
that tailor it to what you like to read. So like what happens there is, like, you know, if I as a left liberal, I like reading left liberal stories, and I continually click on left liberal stories, the more that appears on my internet at all, like wherever I go, like I only see left liberal stories, and that will limit my, like, you know, exposure to another story at all. And I was just wondering, like, aren't we, like, internet media, like, you know, we really cannot wait like 7 years more for it to hit India that big, to have that conversation?
Well, look, I mean, this is a phenomenon that's now being written about, the filter bubble. It's been looked at, examined, criticized. It happens to people. If you look at their Facebook friends, if you look at who they follow on Twitter, there seems to be a closing of circles. You want an echo of your viewpoints, agreement. The question is, if you recognize this consciously, you can do something about it. You know, for example, I don't want Google's memory. I do not keep history on my Google news page. I really do not want Google to give me what I want over and over again. I will go through the selection process every time I look through. I have made a conscious decision to do that. I mean, that choice you will have to exercise. If you are going to be passive and say this is what is happening and not react to it, if in Twitter all you want to hear is the echo of your own viewpoints, and if you are not going to engage with differences or criticisms, then, well, yeah, you will get into that trap. I mean, and there's nobody from outside who can say that there can be no regulation, you know. I mean, nobody is saying that you have to give Google that information or not give that information. Giving that information is easy, it's a passive choice. Not giving that information demands a certain exercise on your part. That is something that each individual will have to do. There's nothing else anybody else can do in that. I mean, I am serious. My Google News does not store history. I will not pass on that history simply because I don't want that filter.
We keep hearing how, how urban India is not the one that's going to decide Lok Sabha elections. And in that context, I was wondering, given your experience, as you said, in smaller towns, how different is the English media, the organization, the way it functions, the pressure that operates on it, different from vernacular media, like the Hindi press, or say, we saw what happened in Andhra, Nadu. How different is it? Are they more susceptible to?
There are huge differences. One is, of course, why does the English media matter so much? Obviously, we are in a class-driven society. By no means the Marxist quite the contrary, but I think there are certain terminologies which are very useful. And English is the language of the elite class. And I mean, one simple statistic, I don't know what it is today. I had done a story, this was before 2010, 2017, looking at the news phenomenon. And I was seeing ad spend on an English news viewer was per viewer was 8 times the ad spend on a Hindi news. Whether it's gone down or gone up, I don't know. But the fact was, you get the influence of one English news viewer, and the advertiser thought was at least 8 times that of a Hindi news viewer. So that is the kind of strength in English news viewer, the kind of opinion that was pushed down. It is true, a large amount of the vernacular media, the Hindi media, looks to the English media for cues on what to report. I'm talking, it will be clear, in 2 very different states. I was in Punjab as a district correspondent in Ludhiana and Jalandhar. I was then a state correspondent in Bhopal for Madhya Pradesh, so I travelled all over the state. Now, what would happen at a press conference, say, in Punjab? There would be a hierarchy. At this time, the Times of India and Hindustan Times had not started editions in Chandigarh. So the two most important people at the press conference would be the Tribune reporter and the Indian Express reporter. And then there would be the Punjab Kesari, the Ajit reporter, the Jagabani. But those newspapers were had circulations compared to the Express, they had circulations which were maybe 50 or 100 times the circulation. And in that scenario, the press conference would give me that much importance and politicians would want to talk to me first tells you about the kind of country or society we are in, and that really does make a difference. It filters down to every level, not only the queues, it is also in terms of the kind of salaries those people are paid, why paid media, paid news is, most of those guys depend on the living for the advertising they give to the newspaper. So the idea of paid news is very, very old. You know, those guys only survive because they can filter some advertisement to newspapers. So yeah, there's a huge difference. The pressures are very different. And at that level, yes, there is a kind of threat that when you say journalists, especially in Delhi, I'm amazed when they talk about crawling, bending, etc. They're pretty well protected at that level. There is a physical threat. There is a threat of being beaten up or being attacked, the dangers of actual physical violence, of losing a job to the extent that you cannot actually survive in that town. Those dangers are very real. Those dangers don't exist in Delhi. I mean, in that sense, the English media is very, very cushioned in terms of any real physical threat to journalists in terms of that.
How is Caravan managing to overcome the present political pressure? Do you have a really sustainable revenue generation?
Look, I just joined Caravan. I'll tell you one thing. It's part of the Delhi press. The Delhi press is a very old media house, and the history of the media house is, you know, it publishes a huge range of Hindi magazines. Graha Shobha, Champak, Sarika, etc., etc. They have pretty large. Those magazines are making. Caravan is not making. There's a cross-subsidization from those magazines that is keeping Caravan afloat. Caravan is by no means breaking even. You know, I mean, it would be very strange when India Today Outlook had not broken even that any magazine so quickly would be able to. But the costs are low. It is run by a small team, and there is enough money from the media itself that is sustaining it. Idea of betraying the nation, we take it even to a greater degree than the Americans. You know, that something is in the national interest. You are not to speak about certain institutions, criticizing the army, taking on the AFPSA is a problem, you know. So when you come to actually betraying state secrets and the idea of one is, I'm not sure if we have that many state secrets to betray. This is a very porous country, but certainly if the situation was similar, a person in Snowden's position would be in far worse trouble. But if he's managed to get out of the country, then this country doesn't have long enough hands to really do anything, even the same way that the Americans.
So I recently read this Sagarika Bose's tweet. It said, soon it will be time to tell the story of what's happening to independent journalists in India. Not a pretty tale. There was another one which said there's an evil out there, an evil which is stamping out all free speech and silencing independent journalists unite. Do you think this is referencing specifically to Modi because there was an article which points out about that since she's been a big critic of her? Or do you think it's overall, like you were speaking, it's been the Congress also which has been doing that and now the BJP is coming?
Look, I draw certain inferences and you can add up the story because I can't prove this. Sagarika hasn't tweeted all this till the time Reliance money came into CNN-IBN. Okay. Now Reliance money is there and there is the elections close by and apparently these tweets reflect a certain kind of pressure. Now, who is influencing the money to put the pressure? You draw your own conclusions. I mean, I think those conclusions are pretty evident.
But then in the same thing, if we look at it as have been pointed out by people at her being criticizing Narendra Modi and that voice being suppressed now, Reliance, as we know, I think is pretty close to Narendra Modi, Reliance, like Mukesh Ambani as such. So that way, the way relation you were creating, that I have a plant in Gujarat or I have my business in Gujarat, then that doesn't really remain.
No, I mean, that she is criticizing hasn't lost all jobs. See, look, it is not going to be crude that you are going to go and when this kind of thing. First of all, I mean, to believe that any big house, business house, will not keep. If you look at the radio tapes, you have Mukesh Ambani saying Congress very Dukan. So I mean, in that sense, what difference does it make to Mukesh Ambani whether it is Modi doing his job or Congress doing the job? You know, so there may be certain other things at work. And in any case, you are not going to get your way by sacking every journalist you disagree with. What is going to happen is over a period of time, the editorial stance shifts in a certain direction, and that is what you have to watch out for. You know, it is not as if suddenly you are going to come and decimate and sack the entire newsroom and replace it. Though in open, that is more or less what has happened. But in CNN-IBN, maybe not so. So there will be always critics around. You know, I mean, even if you want, as I said, you had asked me a question about what kind of influences are going on in newspapers. If the newspaper is giving you propaganda every day of the week or a channel, you're going to shut that channel off and say, why am I paying attention to this? This is obviously a paid channel. It is only if the channel manages to convince you of a certain degree of its credibility, does it matter that they can actually influence editorial stance. You have to realize that it is a far more nuanced game than simply saying, ye to hamara propaganda karega. No? Why did Doordarshan not work? You can't get propaganda blaring at you all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, this is me again. I was wondering about, like, if the difference between the media being not completely, transparent and any other organization being not transparent is that we count on the media to bring out their transparency, other pillars, lack of transparency or what's going wrong with them. When the media plays a quid pro quo game.
That's the whole question. I mean, we have got to live with a whole series of questions in this country which we are not willing to examine. I mean, the whole issue of Bofors and Quattrochi, so much was published. In the end, it's been given a burial. Quattrochi is dead. Nothing has been established. But my God, if you actually go back and look at the original stories and the kind of evidence there was, it is amazing that this could happen.
Okay, last question.
These election days, are you in favor of showing this opinion polls at a time when the media shows a huge difference between the actual results and the opinion polls?
See, there are two kinds of things. One, if there was only a question of opinion polls showing huge differences, I think, so yeah, one is I don't think people tend to take opinion polls with all the degree of seriousness. I think people are well aware of that opinion polls are problematic in this country. But yeah, certainly I think in the same way that we are talking of some transparency in the media, that transparency should extend to opinion polls. One, I believe that opinion polls should not be allowed to give you seat predictions. That is because given our parliamentary system, the whole process of going from votes to seat prediction is not a science. There is no given way that you can actually do that projection. Almost everybody gets it wrong, and this is where the maximum scope for manipulating the final outcome of an opinion poll. And if you look at the stings done on the opinion poll, this is exactly what is happening. You know, they're saying we'll show a different margin of error. As soon as you show a different margin of error, the number of seats changes. So what I'm saying, if you allow transparency in raw data, transparency in methodology, upload it, and restrict them to seat percentage, to vote percentages, and then I think there's a good argument to be made that maybe for 2 days before the poll, 48 hours, 72 hours, that we should show them at that point of time. I think you have these kind of restrictions that should be reasonable. That's my view.
Well, this we would like to express our heartfelt gratitude to Mr. Bal. And aside from everything else we learned here, I would actually like to thank you for being so frank with us. You're one of the very few panelists who would be so frank in whatever you say and in answering questions about the realities of the media. No one even from within the media would like to answer, would like to disclose these open secrets. So right here I would like everyone to give a huge round of applause.